Jackson handpicked Martin Van Buren, his vice president during his second term, to be the next president. So when Van Buren won by a slim margin against his Whig opponent, he was greeted with an unwelcomed Panic of 1837. Basically, Jackson's bad financial policy resulted in huge troubles for Van Buren, and he had to deal with the Panic of 1837. Anytime you hear panic in American history, it just means it was a time of economic depression. During Van Buren's term, Congress passed the Gag Resolution of 1836, which tabled any and all debate about slavery. After 8 years, the Gag Resolution was discontinued. The next president was from the Whig Party. The winning ticket had William H. Harrison as president and John Tyler as vice president. Tyler wasn't a strong supporter of the Whig Party, but the Whigs picked him to increase their chances of winning. Unfortunately for the Whigs, Harrison died in presidency, so naturally Tyler became president. Harrison was the first president to die in office. That's it for politics in this period, but let's discuss culture. Between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, the arts thrived. Naturalist writers wrote about the individual's constant fight against society and the environment. Examples of naturalist work are Moby Dick by Herman Melville and Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. In contrast to naturalists, there were transcendentalist writers who wrote about how God created people as tabula rasa, or blank slate, and they wrote that people were without evil and with the capacity to be perfect. Some famous examples of transcendentalist work are Walden by Henry David Thoreau and Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Also during this time, the Second Great Awakening occurred during the first half of the 1800s. Religious leaders thought people had to purge sin from their lives and seek salvation themselves rather than depend on the church. Also, Mormons settled in Utah in the 1840s seeking escape from persecution for their beliefs. Additionally, social living experiments became popular during the first half of the 1800s. Utopias are social living experiments where everything is perfect. Brook Farms and Oneida Community are examples of two of the most famous living experiments. While some tried finding perfection in social living experiments, others thought it would be more beneficial to reform the society they currently lived in. The average social reformer during the first half of the 1800s was a middle-class woman. Women made a ton of progress culturally speaking. Horace Mann fought for universal public education for school kids. Dorothea Dix fought to improve conditions of insane asylums. Also, women were involved with the temperance movement to ban alcohol in the 1820s, ushering in prohibition with the passage of the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment included the Volstead Act, which banned alcohol. Later on, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment because people just couldn't live without alcohol. Since women were so active and successful in reform, they started focusing on themselves to get voting rights, otherwise known as women's suffrage. They started the fight for women's suffrage but didn't achieve it till much later in the 1920s. The abolitionist movement was very important. Abolitionists were focused on banning slavery in America. William Lloyd Garrison wrote articles in The Liberator urging liberation of all slaves. Frederick Douglass was supported by William Garrison. Both were members of Radical American Anti-Slavery Society. Although people like Garrison and Douglass wanted freedom for slaves in America, other abolitionists supported a plan called Back to Africa, where they wanted to put all the slaves in America in a colony called Liberia. This concludes the first half of the 1800s. The second half consists of Civil War and Reconstruction. Now we will discuss America on the eve of the Civil War. The years preceding the Civil War between 1840-1860 are marked by the U.S. divided into three main sections: the North, the South, and the West. The North was in the process of becoming an industrialized economy. It witnessed mass migrations from people living an agrarian life making the change to move to urbanized cities. The North was a home to Eli Whitney, who invented the concept of interchangeable parts and the cotton gin machine. Interchangeable parts are important because it cut the cost of production by making everything standardized. Prior to this, every single part of every item was unique. Interchangeable parts made everything cheaper. The cotton gin made it easier for slaves to produce cotton. Plantations that used slaves to produce cash crops dominated the South. Their entire economy was dependent on farming, which is why they supported slaves so much. The West was populated because of Manifest Destiny and the Gold Rush. Manifest Destiny was the American belief that they had a God-given right to expand their boundaries throughout North America. This concept of Manifest Destiny inspired people to move westward, which of course didn't work out favorably for Native Americans who were forced to move westward earlier. The Gold Rush of 1849 happened when gold was discovered in the hills of California. Many people moved to California in hopes of finding gold. Boomtowns were established where minerals were thought to be deposited. Once all minerals were mined out, those same boomtowns became ghost towns as everyone left when there were no more minerals. Because of the gold rush, mining was the first industry of the West. When all mineral deposits were depleted, people turned to farming. The government gave away land gifts called homesteads to entice people to move west. President Polk won his presidency on a platform for re-annexing Texas and reoccupying Oregon. Texas belonged to Mexico at the time, and Texas declared its independence from Mexico and applied for statehood. Adding Texas would once again unbalance the number of free versus slave states in Senate, so they quickly had to add another state too. The Mexican-American War ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which made the Rio Grande the southern border of Texas and gave America California and New Mexico. The Oregon Territory was shared by America and Britain, but America wanted complete rights. America and Britain compromised by dividing Oregon along the 49th parallel. Thus, Texas became a SAF state and Oregon became a free state. Later, California applied for statehood and became a free state. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun made the Compromise of 1850. Compromise of 1850 made California a free state, Texas a slave state, divided the remaining territory along the 37th parallel into New Mexico and Utah. New Mexico and Utah were unrestricted, which basically meant those two states themselves would decide if they wanted to be free or slave states. Compromise of 1850 also abolished slave trading in District of Columbia. Lastly, it established the Fugitive Slave Law, which required all citizens to return slaves to their owners in the North and South. The Fugitive Slave Law was controversial because it was clearly in favor of Southern states. Southerners were happy with the law, but they were unhappy that they were outnumbered in the Senate because remember, Oregon was a free state. Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Bill of 1854. It repealed the Missouri Compromise and granted Kansas and Nebraska statehood. It let each locality decide if it wanted to be a free or slave state. Because the decision to be a free or slave state was going to be decided by popular vote by people residing in those regions, hundreds of pro-slavery and anti-slavery proponents rushed to the region to swing the vote in their favor. These people were violent with each other during demonstrations, coining the term Bleeding Kansas. John Brown was an abolitionist who led several successful raids, however he's most remembered for his unsuccessful raid at Harper's Ferry. His goal was to seize weapons to arm a SAV uprising. Unfortunately, he was caught and hung before he could complete his raid at Harper's Ferry. Roger B. Taney, Supreme Court Justice at the time, passed a Dred Scott decision of 1857, in which he permitted slave owners to take their property into any state they wished. It stated that a slave couldn't run away to a free state in the North and expect to be free because the SAV would still be considered property and had no rights. This outraged the North, who perceived it as a policy favoring the South. The abolition movement continued to propel forward. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book called Uncle Tom's Cabin shed light on the cruelty of slavery. The Underground Railroad was a network of abolitionists that helped move runaway slaves from the South to freedom in the North. That's America on the eve of Civil War. Next, we'll talk about Civil War and Reconstruction. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.